Hello, and welcome to our next episode of Rock the Closing, where we will be talking about how long a transaction takes and what is that process and what is the timeline. So, Orsolya, what are the different phases of a real estate transaction?
Hi, Dalia. So we have divided the whole transaction into 4 different phases. In the first phase, there is the deal sheet, from the deal sheet to the binding contract. In the second phase, we have a signed binding contract and we go up until the coordination of the closing. The third phase will be the closing itself. And the fourth one is any post-closing issues that may arise and come up. So these are the 4 phases, and we will be talking about these phases and how long they are taking. Let's dive in, and shall we talk about the first phase? What happens, Dalia, when the seller accepts an offer and the deal sheet is sent to the attorneys? How long does this typically take, and what happens during this first phase of the transaction?
Okay, so we have decided to make a deal. So first comes the deal sheet. That is going to be sent to both the seller's and the buyer's attorney. The seller's attorney will use that to start working on the proposed contract. The timeline for this is pretty quick. It's usually same day, maybe next day, but it's generally within 24 hours. Okay, deals got to be made quickly. Next, the contract is sent to the buyer's attorney. And this is when the buyer's attorney starts their due diligence. So in the case of a co-op, we're looking at a review of the building documents, the financials, anything that's available on public websites, such as the Department of Buildings, the Department of Finance. The buyer's attorney is reviewing the offering plan. And we'll talk about due diligence more in detail in another episode. As well, when we're talking about a house, a freestanding home, we are going to be looking at what's in the inspection report. An inspection is performed by the buyer. This is at the cost of the buyer. They hire an inspector to come in and let them know what's going on with this house. Okay. Also, in the case of a house, there may be an architect or a structural engineer brought in to take a look at the home. You definitely want to know what you're getting into before you buy the house, right? Most time-consuming part of this is if you're purchasing a co-op or a condo, the management company has to respond to the buyer's attorney's questionnaire, all the questions that the buyer's attorney might have about the building. And once they send that, then the buyer's attorney would review board minutes and take a look at all that information. So that could be maybe the most time-consuming portion of this phase. How, Orsolya, do you feel like that process can be expedited?
Right. There are a couple of suggestions we could make here. First, every real estate attorney's dream is to receive a perfect deal sheet, and we talked about it in our previous episode. But what I would like to point out, referring back to the issue you mentioned regarding the management, it's very important that the management information on the deal sheet is correct, and brokers or sellers can help us identify the person who is the best contact when it comes to due diligence questionnaire or obtaining the board minutes. So that's a good way forward, because sometimes to finding out the due diligence process might take a number of days. And obviously you don't want that because you want to go into contract as soon as possible. And let's just stick here for a moment. As you mentioned, management reply can take a while. Again, the way to expedite it is either have your broker work with the management company and establish a good relationship and make sure that the management is responding really quickly and in an expedited manner. The other option, the way you can move management, would be through the seller, because the seller is the owner in the building and they can have an impact on the management, have a good, ongoing conversation, maybe putting the management on notice before the whole sale process is starting, and talk to the management, please help me responding quickly in an expedited manner. So that would be If the seller doesn't have a good relation with the management, which sometimes happens, then the seller can reach out to the board and the board can sort of liaise and the board can help the seller with the management so that the answers are received. From the buyer's perspective, what can the buyer do in order to expedite the whole process is be ready with the down payment, because that's basically the biggest responsibility of buyer in this phase, to be quick sending the down payment either via wire transaction, which is usually the fastest way, to the seller's attorney's escrow account. Or if the buyer doesn't feel comfortable sending a wire, then make sure that the buyer goes into the bank and takes out a certified check. If there is no certified check, it's just a personal check, it could take up to 5-6 days until this is clearing. And again, that adds to the transaction. So when everything is complete, then the contract is signed first by the buyer. When the down payment cleared on the seller's attorney's account, then the seller countersigns the contract, and that's when we talk about complete, a fully binding contract. How long is this first phase process? So usually it takes at least 1 week. If it's a building and you are dealing with a management company, it can go up to 2 weeks, depending how quick the management company is responding to questionnaires. Okay, so let's look at what's happening in the second phase. Dalia, can you help us out a bit, shed some light on it?
Yes, absolutely. So in the next phase, we are looking at the period between having a binding contract and when the closing date gets set. So we have a binding contract now. Once the buyer has in their hand a fully executed contract from all parties, at this point, they should be immediately ordering a title report. Personally, I order it the same day. I send it right when I get it. I send it right away to my title company. Okay, they need to start the searches, the process, because I don't know what's going to be, coming up in these searches. Okay, there are a lot of searches, bankruptcy searches, violations, permit searches, certificate of occupancy searches. There's a survey that needs to be done on the property. Somebody has to physically go out there and measure the property. So all these things take time, and we definitely want to get it started as soon as possible. If we're talking about a co-op, we want to start that lien search right away as well and want to know what's going on with that as well. Also, while this is happening, we are waiting on lender approval, right? So the bank is performing their appraisal of the property, and the buyer should be communicating with the bank, figuring out what it is they need to provide for their loan application. Because if you've ever taken out a mortgage or gotten a loan from a bank, there's definitely a lot of paperwork that goes back and forth. There's follow-up and supplemental documents that need to be provided to the banks. So everyone's sort of got to be on top of it and responding to those requests basically immediately. At this point as well, after we have the binding contract, the attorneys are communicating with the building and the management and the lender. We're all kind of talking to each other. Where are we? How's this going? Any issues? Whatever the case is. As far as a co-op, the purchaser is going to be putting in their application, right? So at this point, we are putting in our application. We are maybe scheduling an interview, and we're waiting on board approval, right? So depending on what's going on with the board and when they meet and how often they review these, that could take some time too. You might want to get your real estate agent involved in that process. They might help speed that along as well. The final phase to getting to the closing date is once all of that has been done, we are now all coordinating our availability to the table. So we want to check with the building, the bank, the lender, the attorneys, the clients, the title closer, all of these people. So we're all on one big email trying to figure out a day and a time to come together for the closing. So, Orsolya, how do you feel like this can be sped up?
Right. So I think you highlighted quite a few really good advice suggestions here. One is that it's really important that all who are involved in the transactions, they keep communicating, they keep checking emails. If there is a request coming from a lender, then you are on top of it and you respond. You're not taking your time. You provide all the documentation. So that's one message I wanted to also emphasize. The other thing is, like, for example, from the beginning, you have a signed contract, you are the purchaser, you know you need to take out a mortgage. Many purchasers will have at this point just a pre-approval letter, and some purchaser will be still thinking about, okay, we are principally approved, but we haven't picked a lender. So that could be also time consuming that, oh, I already signed a contract and now I'm going to start shopping around which lender would give me the best requirements for a long-term mortgage. Don't do that. Try to identify your lender, understand what is going to be the interest rate, which lender is the most favorable for you. So even before signing the contract, just try to identify the lender that you are going to start the process on the day you sign the contract. So you are not losing out again with shopping around for lenders a number of days. So that's where you can shorten it down. And then secondly, again, for the buyer, whether you have a lender or not, and if you are buying into a condominium or a cooperative, and the emphasis in the cooperative apartment, prepare your board package, start preparing it. Some buildings require very comprehensive, even more detailed information from you as a buyer than lenders. I've seen more complex board package applications than it is required by any banks. So start working on it as soon as possible. If you take out the mortgage and you have X number of days after your loan commitment letter is issued to submit your board package, don't wait. Don't wait until you have your loan commitment letter in your hand and start compiling your board package afterwards, because it can be a lengthy process. Have your board package ready so when your loan commitment letter comes in, the next day you can submit it to the board. And then one final issue, before the closing is happening, there is a so-called walkthrough that needs to be scheduled. That's a final walkthrough before you are sitting at the closing table. It's your interest to go through one more time the property, the apartment, to check that everything is as it was at the time of the contract signing, that nothing has changed. And if by chance any issue is coming up, try to resolve it through your brokers, negotiate an abatement or resolve the issue by getting some kind of commitment from the seller. Again, either through the brokers or the attorneys can help navigate this process. Make sure that by the time you are sitting down to close, there is no outstanding issues coming up at the closing table. So that would be a couple of suggestions, but now let's look, how can we rock the closing? Dalia.
Great advice, Orsolya. So, okay, we are at the closing table. We want to make sure that that walkthrough went very well, because that is your last opportunity to look at that property before you own it, okay? So you want to make sure that any issues that you have seen have been resolved prior to the closing. So you might want to do it the night before, early that morning. I don't usually suggest like right before the closing. It's a little tight if there are any issues. Now we're squabbling about it at the closing table, which is, not preferable. The other thing you want to make sure about is that as a buyer, your money is readily available. So this means that you have it, it's liquid. It is not in a brokerage account or securities account or anything like that. Your attorney should provide you with a list of checks to bring. Some of those checks might be personal if they're small, but any big checks are going to be certified checks or bank checks. So you want to make sure you have the correct amounts, triple check it with your attorney. You want to make sure that who they're made out to and the spelling is absolutely correct. If your check is rejected at the closing table because of a misspelling in someone's name on a check, that's going to be a problem and it's going to cause huge delays. The other thing I suggest is kind of obvious, but definitely needs to be said is bring your photo IDs. I suggest bringing 2 because some lenders require 2 forms of ID, 1 photo and maybe 1 not. The other thing is if you're selling a home, make sure you bring the keys to the property. If you have any pamphlets or information that you might want to bring, that would be helpful too. Maybe if someone's moving into your home from out of town, you want to bring them information about who the local electricity company is, the water company, the, cable, that would definitely be a courteous thing to do. Also bring your checkbook. You just never know what's going to come up in closing, additional fees or what have you. So that could definitely come up as well. In general, closings can take between 1 and 2 hours, but you can be there for a while because issues do come up. There's a lot of people in that room, and any one of them could be having some kind of mishap, a technical issue, a copier or a scanner is not working, the bank didn't bring the correct checks, it's taking longer to wire the mortgage to the seller's bank, somebody didn't get notice of where the closing was happening and is running late. So these are all pretty common issues. So while we say that it should take between 1 and 2 hours, you should really clear several hours for it. Maybe 3 or something like that is pretty safe. Okay. After the closing, it's just what it is. We're closed. We're done. All issues should be resolved, but sometimes they're not. So Orsolya, what are some examples of issues that might be happening after the closing?
Right. So let me just think of maybe perhaps mention 2 that can prolong that you get either your money or occupancy. So one issue that might come up, and it's quite common actually, is the post-closing occupancy. This is something negotiated prior to closing by the parties, usually the parties' attorneys. Seller requires more time to remain in possession because they need more time to, after the closing, more time to move out for one or another reason. And then you close, so the buyer becomes the new owner. However, the seller will usually pay a daily fee to the buyer for the time, for the length he is staying in the apartment. How long this takes is basically based on the agreement between the buyer and the seller. So it can be from 30 days to 6 months, but usually just a shorter amount. Then another issue that may come up, be holding back some money in escrow. Something came up and the seller makes a commitment to take care of it. For example, a house was modified and there is no certificate of occupancy. The seller may take on that he will make sure that a certificate of occupancy is issued by the city, and then the seller's attorney will be holding back money in the escrow and the money will be released when the certificate of occupancy has been obtained. The same applies for an open permit. So this can happen, that delays that the seller received the money, or in the other example, that the buyer is able to move into the premises. So let me just recap here and summarize that in conclusion, what we have been talking about, all the 4 phases. So basically, when it is a cash transaction, the buyer is going to pay all the monies in cash, usually from the very beginning till the very end. And I'm not talking about the post-closing issues, but till the closing table, till we are closing. Usually it can take up to 30 days. That would be a good guess. So 30 days for a cash transaction. If the purchaser has to take out a loan, in that case, usually the transaction takes about 45 to 60 days. But in any case, any party may request that if both parties are willing and able, they can close earlier than the foreseen closing date, or they can adjourn the closing by up to 30 days. So when the mortgage is taken out, this could be like 90 days. When it's a cash transaction, it's usually going to be like 60 days. So this would be the timelines that a closing, a whole transaction, a real estate transaction would mean. Thank you. Dalia, what are we going to talk about next in the next episode?
Well, first, I'd just like to thank our listeners for tuning in. And I'd like to ask you to tune into our next episode when we will be talking about what is due diligence. Okay, so that's a big one. You don't want to miss it. Thank you so much for listening. See you next time on Rock the Closing.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for tuning in to Rock the Closing. This podcast is hosted by real estate attorneys who offer valuable insights. Please remember that the content is for educational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Always consult a qualified professional before making any decisions. This podcast is copyrighted by Rock the Closing, and any reproduction, syndication, or rebroadcasting of the content requires written permission.